My name's Mark, and you're listening to Head Straight. Hello, you lot, and welcome back. Friendships. They're a strange thing, aren't they? Some people seem to come into our lives almost by accident, and within a few weeks, it's hard to imagine life without them. We spend time together, message each other every day, share things that we'd never tell anyone else, and somehow they become part of what feels normal for us. That's why it can feel really unsettling when, without any obvious reason, something starts to change. Now, maybe you're not seeing each other as much as you used to. Maybe the messages become less frequent, conversations feel different, or you're the one who always has to make the effort to stay in touch. Sometimes nothing dramatic has happened at all, yet you can't shake the feeling that things aren't what they used to be. And when that happens, it's incredibly easy to assume that the change must somehow be about you. Now, I've often wondered why that's our first instinct. We rarely stop to think that friendships, like people, naturally evolve. Instead, we start searching for evidence that we've done something wrong. We replay conversations, analyse messages, wonder if we said the wrong thing, or we convince ourselves that everyone has just moved on without us. It's almost as though our minds would rather blame us than accept that sometimes relationships change for reasons that aren't anyone's fault. I don't think the real question is about why friendships change. I think the more interesting question is why those changes can feel so personal. Because if you've ever found yourself lying awake, wondering whether you're being forgotten, replaced or left behind, then you're probably not just trying to understand a friendship. You're trying to understand what that friendship change says about you. And those are two very different conversations. Now, one of the things that I noticed is that we often talk about friendships as though they're all supposed to follow the same pattern. We almost imagine that if somebody becomes a close friend, then they'll always be a close friend. And if that changes, then something must have gone wrong. But when you stop and look at your life, that's probably never been true. Think back over the last couple of years or so. There'll almost certainly have been people who, for a while, were a huge part of your everyday life. You saw them constantly, shared experiences together, and probably knew what was going on in each other's lives without even having to ask. Then life changed. Maybe one of you moved schools, started college, found a job, got into a serious relationship, or simply met different people. Without anyone making a conscious decision, the friendship slowly occupied a different place in your life. Now, the interesting thing is that when we look back at those friendships years later, they often don't feel like failures. We recognise them as part of that particular chapter of our lives. Yet, when we're living through that same process in the present, it's much harder to see it that way. It feels uncertain because we don't know where the story is going. We don't know whether we're watching a friendship gradually come to an end, whether it's simply going through a quieter period, or whether life is just asking a little bit more of us for a while. Now, I found myself thinking about that whilst I was putting this episode together. And perhaps one of the hardest things isn't that friendships change, it's that they rarely announce that they're changing. There isn't usually a conversation where somebody says, "You're still important to me, but our lives are starting to head in different directions." Be a bit weird if that happened anyway. Instead, we notice little things. The conversations become less frequent. Plans become harder to arrange. Somebody else seems to know more about their lives than we do. Our minds naturally join those dots together, and because we don't have the full picture, we often create one of our own. That's where I think we can be really hard on ourselves. We fill the gaps with our own fears. We make the assumption that we're no longer interesting enough, funny enough, or important enough. We tell ourselves that we've been replaced. Now, sometimes that's true, but very often it's simply the story that our anxious mind reaches for because uncertainty is really uncomfortable. It's much easier for the brain to settle on an explanation, even a painful one, than to sit with not knowing at all. Now, I sometimes wonder whether that's why friendship changes can feel so much more painful during our teenage years than they often do later in life. It's not simply because somebody isn't replying to your messages anymore, or you don't spend as much time together. At that stage of life, friendships become woven into how we see ourselves. They're part of where we find our confidence, our belonging, and in many ways, our identity. When somebody asks you who you are as a teenager, the answer often includes other people. It's the group that you sit with at lunchtime. It's the people you walk home with, the friends you always message first, the people who make you laugh until your stomach hurts. Those relationships become part of the picture you have of your own life. So when one of those friendships starts to shift, it can feel as though part of that picture is shifting as well. I think that's why it's so easy to confuse change with rejection. If somebody doesn't invite you somewhere, or they're spending more time with someone else, your mind doesn't usually begin with a calm, balanced explanation. It begins with the question, what does this say about me? Now, that's a very human response. We all do it to some degree. But during adolescence, when you're still working out who you are, those questions can become incredibly loud. But the problem is, we only ever see our side of the story. We know how often we've thought about sending a message. We know how much we've missed seeing someone. We know the conversations we're replaying in our minds. What we don't see is everything that's happening in the other person's life. We don't see the pressure they're under, the worries they might be carrying, the changes happening in their family, or the fact that they may be asking exactly the same questions about somebody else. The more I've thought about this, the more I've realised how much uncertainty our minds struggle with. We seem to prefer an explanation, even a painful one, rather than no explanation at all. So if we don't know why a friendship feels different, our brains often write the ending for us. They don't like us anymore. I've been replaced. Obviously, I wasn't that important to them. Now, once we've reached that conclusion, it's amazing how quickly we start looking for evidence to support it. And that's something I'd really like you to notice if this episode feels familiar to you. Not because those thoughts are silly, not because they never turn out to be true, because our minds have a habit of presenting that one possible explanation as though it's the only explanation. Sometimes friendships are changing. Sometimes people are growing in different directions. Sometimes life is simply becoming busier. Sometimes there is a problem that needs talking about. The point is that those possibilities all exist at the same time, yet our anxious minds tends to choose the one that hurts us the most. Now, perhaps one of the biggest myths that we carry around is that a good friendship is one that never changes. Now, I don't know where this idea comes from, but it's surprisingly common. We almost judge the quality of a friendship by how long it lasts, as though the friendship that quietly drifts apart somehow counts for less than the ones that stay with us for years. Now, I'm not convinced that's true. If you think about it, some people become incredibly important to us during one particular part of our lives. They help us through a difficult year at school. They're there for us when our family life feels chaotic. They make us laugh when we desperately need something to smile about. Or they simply make us feel less alone. At that point in your life, that friendship is absolutely real. It matters. It shapes you. It changes you. The fact that life later takes you in different directions doesn't cancel out any of that. In fact, I sometimes wonder whether we're asking too much of our friendships. We almost expect one person to stay exactly the same, whilst we ourselves are constantly changing. Yet, if you think about it, take a look at what happens between the ages of 13 and 20. It's unbelievable just how much we change. Our interests change, our confidence changes, our ambitions change, our relationships change, and hopefully our understanding of ourselves changes as well. So, why would we expect every friendship to remain exactly as it was, whilst everything around us is evolving? Now, that doesn't mean that changes in friendships never hurts. Of course it does. There can be a genuine sense of loss, and it's okay to acknowledge that. We don't have to pretend that we're fine when somebody who mattered to us slowly becomes less involved in our lives. And actually, I think it's really healthy to recognise that sadness for exactly what it is. The mistake that we sometimes make is assuming that sadness automatically proves that the friendship has failed. Now, those are two very different things. A friendship might have been exactly what you needed at that point in your life, and still not be the friendship that you need now. That's not failure. That's growth. Sometimes it's your growth. Sometimes it's theirs. And often, it's both of you. Now, as I've been thinking this through, I've found myself wondering whether we're actually talking about grief. Not the kind of grief that we usually associate with somebody dying, but the quieter kind that comes with recognising that a chapter of your life has ended. And we don't always notice it happening. One day, you suddenly realise that you haven't spoken to somebody for months, or you walk past somewhere where you used to spend every weekend together and it feels strangely unfamiliar. You're not just missing the person, you're missing the version of your life that existed when they were part of it. And I think that's an important distinction, because it means that the feeling isn't necessarily telling you that you need to get the friendship back. It may simply be telling you that something meaningful has changed. And meaningful changes nearly always bring mixed emotions. There could be gratitude, sadness, uncertainty, and acceptance all sitting alongside each other. And human beings are perfectly capable of feeling all of those feelings at the same time. Perhaps that's one of the quieter parts of growing up that nobody really talks about. We expect to change ourselves. We expect to grow in confidence, discover new interests, meet different people and gradually work out who we are. Yet, somehow, we don't always allow the people around us to go through that same process. Maybe that's why changing friendships can catch us by surprise. We're expecting our lives to keep moving, but we're hoping that the people within it will somehow stay exactly the way that they've always been. Now, the more I've thought about this episode, the more I've realised that perhaps friendships aren't really meant to be measured by how long they last. Maybe they're better understood by what they give us whilst they're part of our lives. Some friendships teach us how to laugh again after a difficult time. Some show us what loyalty feels like. Some give us confidence that we didn't know we had. Some challenge us, frustrate us, and teach us different lessons about ourselves. Some stay with us for decades. Others quietly become part of our history. None of those relationships are meaningless because they didn't last forever. If anything, they're all part of the story of how we become the people we are. So, if you're listening to this because a friendship feels different at the moment, I don't want to pretend that it's easy. It isn't. If somebody has mattered to you, it's completely understandable that you'll feel hurt, confused, or even a little bit lost whilst you're trying to work out what's changing. But before you decide that you've been rejected, before you convince yourself that you weren't important, before you tell yourself that everyone else has moved on without you, just hold on to the possibility that there may be a bigger picture that you can't see yet. Life has a habit of moving people around. Sometimes those paths come back together. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the friendships that feel as though they're fading today quietly find their way back months or even years later. And sometimes they become an important chapter that you'll always look back on with gratitude rather than sadness. Neither outcome means that the friendship wasn't real. Neither outcome means that you weren't enough. It simply means that life keeps moving, and all of us are trying to find our place within it. Now, if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from today's conversation, it's this. Try not to judge the value of a friendship purely by how long it lasted. Judge it by how it changed you. Because the people who pass through our lives don't just leave us with memories. They leave us with confidence, experience, perspectives, and parts of ourselves that often stay long after the friendship has changed. And perhaps that's a much kinder way of looking at growing up. Not as a series of people we're losing, but as a lifetime of people who, in different ways, helped us to become who we are today. So, if you're still with me, if you haven't pressed stop, I want to thank you for spending the time with me today. And as always, if this conversation has brought up thoughts or feelings that feel bigger than you can manage on your own, please remember that you don't have to do that. Find someone else to talk to. But if you're not ready to do that, then maybe just keep thinking about it for a while. So, next week, we have another question coming up. Are you up for it? Of course you are.